Hello, and thank you for joining us. If you've not been with us for this series before, let me introduce myself. I'm Aasiya Lodhi, a trustee of the Stuart Hall Foundation and a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the third and final event of the Foundation's conversation series, Reading the Crisis, part of our 2024 programme, Catastrophe and Emergence. Catastrophes no doubt signal a crisis of survival, knowledge and power, but we also know they can herald renewal, political closures and openings, the demise of old ways of knowing, and the emergence of new ways to relate to our ever-changing world. Against that backdrop, this conversation series asks us to think about what kinds of tools and strategies we need for the moment and for some of the many crises we currently face. From attacks on protest to the deepening of austerity, to the horrors unleashed on Gaza, the defence of confected culture wars, and the slow creep of diversity optics, a topic I suspect we'll be discussing later on today. These all come together to form what we could argue is a snapshot of our conjuncture, that rich and yet knotty term so powerfully used by Stuart Hall. In today's conversation, we're turning to his 1990 essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora. Like the two previous essays we've examined in this series, Hall's ideas speak, of course, of the time in which they were written, in this case, the changing ways diasporic cultures were being represented and conceptualised more than 30 years ago. And yet there are important aspects of Hall's essay on difference and on the meanings of culture that stretch over the past 3 decades to resonate strongly with us now. We'll be hearing more on that today from two eminent thinkers who've grappled with culture, identity, and with Hall's work over a long period of time, and I'll introduce them both shortly. But again, as we said last time, we hope you were able to read this essay and that you'll share in the conversation. Our speakers will be in dialogue for about 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions in the second half. So please submit any questions or comments using the Q&A box at any point, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Automated live captions are available by clicking the CC button. There'll also be a video recording of this conversation in due course. But now, let's welcome our guests. Gail Lewis is visiting Professor of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University, as well as Reader Emerita in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck, University of London. Gail worked with Stuart Hall at the Open University for some time and co-authored with him a submission on racial stereotyping for the Macpherson inquiry into the killing of Black British teenager Stephen Lawrence. In her own words, and I quote, Gail has written, but is trying to become a writer. Gail likes to speak, but is still seeking her tonalities. Gail sometimes feels lonely, inept, and scared. But Gail is brought into being in and by the company, care and joy of Black and or women of colour feminisms and queer knowings and livings. Roderick Ferguson is the William Robertson Co-Professor of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Yale University. He's the author of One-Dimensional Queer, We Demand, the University and Student Protests, The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, and Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Colour Critique. Roderick is also co-editor with Grace Hong of Strange Affinities, the Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization, and of Keywords of African American Studies with Erica Edwards and Jeffrey Ogbar. He was the recipient of the Kessler Award from the Centre for LGBTQ Studies in 2020. Welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you here. Gail, I wondered if I could begin with you, given your very long engagement with Hall and his work, which I sort of alluded to earlier in the introduction. At the broadest level, it seems to me that Hall is arguing here that in this essay, that cultural identity, especially in its diasporic formations, is not something that sits outside of representation. Representation is not in the title, but it's a key theme of this essay. But it's made within representation, if you like. And he's writing specifically at the start of the essay about a third cinema, he calls it. That's visual representations of Afro-Caribbean and Asian diasporas in the West. How important do you think that identification of that relationship between cultural identity and representation was at the time?
Oh, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be in this conversation. And hello to everybody out there who I can't see, but welcome. I think it was crucial. I think it was absolutely crucial at the time. If we do go back and try to think about, 1990, in a sense, when the essay was published, we'd come through in the UK a long period of sustained attack on modes of social life, on class-based politics, on racialized minoritized groups across the society. And there was a whole breakdown, really, led by the Thatcherite revolution, of the old kind of social democratic post-Second World War social contract, in which there was already an imagination of how we were tied together as people, citizens and others in the United Kingdom. And that was, with all its problems of that moment of the social contract, that was being radically erased through the Thatcherite project for the emergence of what Stuart Hall and Doreen Massey called, you know, the emergence of neoliberalism in the UK. The context of that, of course, was that there'd been lots and lots of protest by class-based and racialized oppositions to the policing, the ever more tyrannical policing and governance of the social fabric in that sense, including the miners' strike, of course, which was the kind of, in a sense, symbolic, I think, of the last defeat of class-based strength at that point, but also very much in terms of Black and Asian communities really being mobilized in all sorts of ways to oppose the police and to oppose the ways in which communities were governed. Central to that moment, I think, was the emergence of a kind of what was called Black British cinema, you know, and the whole production really of the Black arts movement that was building up in the 80s and that was offering us other ways in which to imagine and experience ourselves as racialized minorities in a context where we were still deemed as immigrants, although we were beginning to be called, you know, ethnic minorities, etc., and that kind of stuff. We were still positioned as outsiders. And how do we imagine ourselves, especially as a younger generation, you know, a point where it was our parents who had moved and we were so-called the second generation? How could we imagine ourselves and experience ourselves both in terms of our own groups of identity and across racialized groups? So the ways in which we'd organize under the sign Black to convene a whole set of racialized populations. And what this essay does, I think, is intervene into that moment. It is an example, I think, of Stuart's attempt at conjunctural analysis to understand the specificities of the now and the ways in which political, economic, social and cultural forces come together in their specificity in a particular moment. What is the conjuncture? What's the shape? In a sense, what's the intersection in one way of thinking about it? But what's that configuration look like? And what's it therefore possible? What becomes possible? How to imagine ourselves? And Stuart in this essay is intervening and saying, look, we need to understand that identities are always in process of becoming, and they're contained or they're produced with it, they're productions in particular contexts. And this was an intervention that said, let's think about what makes it possible. He uses Jamaica as the example in terms of Black, but we could carry that over. What made it possible for us for a while to organize under a sign called Black that wasn't only about Africa diaspora people? What made it possible? And how did we live and experience our identities in that? Now, my own view is that that was particularly held by, that position was held by Black feminisms that held that version, that sign together as a sign of organization in a way that was more sustained than in other areas. But the Black arts movement was doing that too, I think. So it was a crucial intervention because it helped us to understand ourselves, but it also helped us to think, we can go on, keep on changing and becoming other than which we know. We're not going back to some essentialized but lost and hidden identity that was given by nature almost. So I think, and representation was crucial for that, of course, because it's in representation.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was a very expansive and very detailed answer. I have just lots of things I want to come back to, including your touching there on political blackness in the United Kingdom and on its relationship to feminism here. But Roderick, can I just bring you in, obviously, in the American context? I wondered if perhaps you could expand on some of those points that Gail has made about the uses and the limitations of imagination in relation to what Hall says in this essay, because he sees cultural identity as positioned and enunciated. He describes it as such in the essay, and he says identity is not, as Gail has just said, a fixed essence, but neither is it purely imagined, right? And rather he views it as forged in, he says, the material and symbolic shaping of its past, but to go further, to articulate a contemporary political position. So I wondered how that, speaks to you in the American context, either in the 90s or in the decades since.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, and hello to everyone. It's wonderful to be here. One of the main arguments of the piece is precisely that, it's kind of what Gail was saying, that cultural identity is not given to us by nature. It is part of, a kind of a part of political struggles. It's part of, sort of political cultural representations, which means that, it can be rewritten, and it can be written, and it can also be rewritten, right? And when I think of the 90s, that's exactly what that's how I think of the 90s. I began the 90s as an undergraduate at Howard University. It was the moment of, where Black independent cinema was still very much alive, right? And so I remember going to see Halle Garima's Sankofa, in Washington, D.C., and then some months or a year later, seeing Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, at the same time. And so in both films, you see the past of, in one film, slavery, and the other film, migration, being rewritten, so that, thinking here of Julie Dash's film, the history of migration, the histories of Black womanhood have to be told in terms of, racialized and sexual violence having to do with rape. So in many ways, it was displacement of the sort of master narrative of lynching as the way of framing migration, and the sort of centrality of Black cisgendered men to that narrative. And so, with that film, we saw a kind of rearticulation at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, the meanings of Black womanhood. That was hugely important for me. And then in 1994, I go to the University of California, San Diego. And it's really in that context that the category, person of color or communities of color, became salient for me as political categories, right? Because in 1994, there was the anti-immigrant Proposition 187 on the ballot in California. And I remember that was the first time that I voted, in California. And I thought, oh, this is absurd. No one's going to vote in favor of a proposition that says that because you're an immigrant, you don't deserve, sort of public services around healthcare, around education, around worker protection. And then it passed overwhelmingly, right? And then after that, it was the English only proposition, as a way to sort of marginalize, particularly Spanish-speaking communities, within the state. And then after that, it was the anti-affirmative action Proposition 209. It was in that context that at UC San Diego in California, you really saw, a burgeoning cross-racial, cross-ethnic politics and coalitions forming. So that, for instance, many of us, we're trying to figure out both in our work and in our activism, if we're Asian American, if we're Chicano, if we're African American, how do we articulate those identities, histories, so that they are in dialogue with, sort of other racial and cultural formations. So again, here, the rewriting of, cultural identity and minority cultures, for the purpose of responding to, the state and, capitalist economic formations, assault on whole swaths of minoritized populations.
Thank you. Very interesting. Again, lots of things I want to pick up on, and I'm sure I'll come back to those. But just thinking about difference, I suppose, which is the other sort of key word that comes out of this essay, and it reads very much of its time in that sense. I mean, it's an essay that Hall wrote not long after the sort of new ethnicities and that kind of interest in hybridity and syncretism. And there's a sort of tension in this essay, isn't there? And I wonder in this idea of sort of identity always becoming something, cultural identity always is a motion of, a process rather than a finished end product. But then Hall also talks about the sort of, the kind of Jacques Derrida approach to a deferral of meaning that was also very popular at that time and will become very modish in the 90s, that sort of infinite postponement of meaning where it doesn't then get locked down into any kind of political solidarity. So I wanted to ask you, Gail, and Rod, please feel free to jump in, how were those tensions resolved by Hall, do you think, and how have they then kind of been amplified in the decades since, or have they been resolved in some other ways, or other contradictions come to light? I mean, representation, which is also the other half of difference, is not always unproblematic, is it? And I don't think he's saying it's unproblematic in this essay, but I think perhaps in the last 30 years we've seen it become quite problematic. The diversity optics that I was referring to earlier, for example. Gail, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have no idea how it's resolved. I think we live with the tension. And I'm not sure that I think that Stuart resolved it. But what I do think is there's a track that's laid down in this essay and in some of the other essays that perhaps help us to do the work of trying to think about it. And that's the track of identification. Because he talks about, identities in all the ways that we've just talked about, but he also says that it's identification as part of the process. And in doing that, he's referring to, implicitly in a sense, to the psychic dimensions of being positioned by and taking up positions in discourse. So it's the psychic dimension. So it's not just social cultural processes, but it's the stuff that gets into us, the ways in which the logics of normativity get into us and help us to think, this is the truth of the world. And one of those truths would be a kind of psychic truth, that identity is fixed and given. It does come with particular bodies. If you have a body called female, then the proper psychic resolution of that will be to take up a position as feminine. Okay, and that would make sense. That would make you fit in the world. Similarly with masculinity. And Hall talks about identification here, and he talks about the ways in which this is unstable, and this is where the suturing comes. Okay, so if we hold on to the idea that identities are always in process of becoming, there'll be two kind of holds on that act to kind of pull us back in a way. One will be the material context of lives. For example, if you have a class position and you think, I can always be going on becoming in what it means to be of a particular class, working class I'm thinking of here, But the idea somehow, but actually you still can't put food on the table or pay the rent, or you're frightened about the knock on the window that's going to come because it's the bailiffs, then the idea that you kind of can just go on to become another kind of ongoing process of class identity gets stopped a bit. You need to make sense of the material realities around you. Now, Hall talks about that, of course. But the other stop will be psychically, can I bear to let go of what I feel is me, the true me, the real me, the authentic me that's given, that I've inherited through the old logics, the old ways of discussing identity, and allow myself to be freed up by what's on offer in these new cultural moments, in the new modes of representation that are emerging. And I think that's, in some senses, what comes to my mind is Twilight City, the film Twilight City, where she's writing to her mother, who's gone, telling her story. Mum, I'm really not who you thought I am. I'm all these different things. You know, there's a queering of the question of identity in this. And Mum has gone home to be able to be her old self, in a way, if I'm remembering right. But Mum then wants to come back to London. And we get a sense of the psychic struggles of inhabiting a space in ourselves and in the world around us that says we are always in process of becoming, because sometimes that just feels too fragile, too destabilizing to a very kind of ontology of self, a very sense of, oh, this is me. And I think Hall gives us, in his unfully worked out notion of identification, if we go to psychoanalysis and try to think with identification, he offers us a way to say, not to resolve, but to understand more the tensions that you point to us here, I think, in that way. So I'd say that. You probably said something else at the end of that, and I've lost it.
I always ask very long questions. Rod, do you want to come in on that, on the psychoanalysis? I mean, he does talk about Fanon quite a lot in this essay as well, so he is addressing that. But also the tensions, I think, that are sort of writ large in your work, which is the ways in which difference can be assimilated and has become increasingly so, right? And there's in student experience, which you write of, for example.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that part that you just mentioned, Aasiya, is, you know, I got that from Stuart Hall. I mean, you know, in terms of the argument in The Local and the Global, you know, that essay, that, you know, global capital, you know, sort of uses, manipulates forms of cultural difference, you know, as a kind of branding exercise for itself, you know, for purposes of commodification. He says that, you know, you can go to New York and experience Asia through the cuisine and vice versa. You know, so that, you know, if difference can go either way, it means that there will never be resolution, right? So the question isn't resolution. The question is, what are the various ways in which identity and culture are being deployed, right? So if you think of this, you know, in terms of the essay that we're talking about, you know, it's in terms of, you know, what he describes as the sort of production of an essentialist notion of culture and difference versus a kind of re-articulative notion of culture and difference. And they often intersect, you know, I mean, that's the point about, you know, that Gail is making, but also the point, as I take it, about identification and the use of Fanon. It's very easy to say that power, you know, if we're thinking of here, the static notion of culture, power deploying that, you know, for its own purposes. It's very easy to say that power does that, power is outside of me. But what happens when we acknowledge that we're doing it, you know, that it also lives in us as well. So there's not a resolution at the site of the level of social structure. There's also not a resolution at the site of psychic structures, right? So then the question is, is how do we track, the sort of itineraries of power in the social and in the psychic, but also the disruptions of power within the social and within me, and for progressive folks, it's like, so how do we produce a kind of political economy in which the disruptions, the new possibilities are greater than the sort of conservative articulations and unfoldings of things,
Yes.
And to know as well, sorry, just to say, and to know as well that the social structures and the psychic structures don't necessarily move together at the same pace. And that the psychic structures, the defensive moves that we make in order to survive ourselves, may put a brake, actually, although we may not be aware of it, on the very kind of logics of the social movement, social push that we're trying to achieve. And that's what we need to attend to try to understand that as a break and a stoppage.
Yeah, if I can add to that, one of the things that, he's also very good about noting for us in this piece, but also you find it in cultural studies and its theoretical legacies. You mentioned the deferral of difference using Derrida, for instance, Aasiya. And he says, well, at some point there has to be a stop. Like it can't be an endless deferral.
Exactly.
In this piece, he says it in terms of Derrida, right? And that stop is where politics comes in. There has to be a point. In cultural studies and its theoretical legacies, he doesn't use the figure of Derrida, he uses the figure of cultural studies, right? There can't simply be the endless interrogation of difference in meaning. There has to be a point. He says it's nothing if there's not a stake,
Exactly.
and it's that stoppage, the arbitrariness of the stop, and also articulating stakes that for him is, the moment of a politicization.
And the way that would manifest itself, I think that moment of stop, say in the British context, well, I guess in any context, but in the British context at the time, is the ways in which particular identity groups, if you like, made claims against the state for full access to services, recognition, etc. That was a moment of stop. As a Black woman, we make this claim. As gays and lesbians, we protest, pretend, Section 28, etc. That kind of stuff. We do that stop in order to make claims against the state, whilst also holding on to a parallel set of politics that says that identities are always in process of becoming. So I think...
Absolutely. Gail, I wanted to just go back to some of those points you made in relevance in relation to your actual experiences in the 70s and 80s in relation to Black British feminism, because you were talking there about the uses of political Blackness, which I think is in stark contrast to the development of, for example, Black radicalism as it's conceived in America. And for example, your role, which I didn't mention in the introduction, the setting up of OAD, the Organisation for Women of African and Asian Descent, which was so important to the development of feminism in this country. And Hall makes a sort of reference to feminism in this article, although in this essay, although it's, I think, broadly conceived, not necessarily about Black British feminism. And how can we conceive, therefore, both of you have mentioned very movingly sort of cross-racial solidarities, class solidarities, the importance of different political solidarities which move your progressive vision of the world. How do you think sort of feminism fits into this essay, but also the things that we can draw out from what he's writing about identification in the development of his thinking at that time?
Well, I think I think probably OAD is a very good example of the ways in which the possibility of being not yet quite formed persons with particular identities was a really good example. So OAD, just one little backstory just to say, when we formed OAD, we were originally going to call it the National Black Women's Organisation. And because the people involved in the conversations about setting up what became OAD included many sisters from a student-based group called African Red Family that had sisters from all over the continent. And when we said we'll call it Black, including obviously those of us from the Caribbean and from the continent, etc., but who had been born in Britain or raised in Britain. Okay, so we said we'd call it the National Black Women's Organisation, and some of the sisters said, Black Women's Organisation from the continent. Why would we call ourselves Black Women's Organisation? That makes no sense to us. Who the term Black made sense to was those of us who'd been raised in Britain and sisters from South Africa and Zimbabwe because of apartheid and Smith, where there was a racial logic of whiteness, against which. So then we realized, so Black as a name under which even those of us of the diaspora can convene doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not so inclusive in that sense. So we call it the organisation, then it went to Organisation of Women of African and African Descent, but then Asian sisters will work with us, so we changed it to include that. Okay. But I'm just pointing out how the different kinds of, if you like, the names as categories of representation on level that could have appeal to diverse constituencies had to keep changing because we were in process of becoming something that could appeal to different organizations, okay, because we were an umbrella group. And I think then in that sense, the what we now call political blackness, did we call it that at the time? I don't know. We said as a political term, but anyway, that's another thing. But what became known as political blackness, I think there was an attempt to say we can form alliances and solidarities with each other in ways that resist the colonial logics that separated us back home. And here we can kind of convene together to show to point to and protest the shared conditions of our being in Britain at that time. Now, of course, there were all sorts of tensions in there as well. It's what did come to the fore, what got muted, what got pushed out of the conversation. But there was a way in which it did enable us to hold on to solidarities, and I think is indicative of the kind of thing that we're talking about here as identities being formed in the context of the particularities of the now, in that sense, in the conjuncture, in that sense. And so I think that's what happened. That's how I think about it now. Of course, then eventually it changed, and now we talk about Black and brown women and queer and etc., rather than Black in the old time way that we used to.
Has that got in the way, can I ask both of you, in the way of formations of new forms of solidarity, do you think, or no?
The breakdown, you mean, or the...
Yes, I mean, I think terms in themselves are obviously, they're only one iteration of it, as you say, but I'm wondering if perhaps, I mean, there's a lot of questions, we will get to these, unsurprisingly, there's already a lot of questions in the chat box about Kamala Harris.
Rod. Over to you.
I'll be over to you, Rod.
We can just play Beyonce power.
There's a lot about that, and but yes, well, perhaps I could just jump to this question that is a little bit early, but to Sarah's question, which is that she says, I have been writing for a few years now about Stuart Hall's essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, to better understand diasporic feminist Stuart Hall and his activism and conjunctural analysis. But her question is, how much has the concept of the diasporic changed in more globalized forms of activism and understanding diasporic knowledge production today? I suppose that's a term as well that it speaks very much of that time, doesn't it? Qualifying those of us in Britain, those of us of colonized heritage who were in Britain at that moment, which again is slightly different to how it might be conceived of in America. Is the diaspora still a term that carries a lot of resonance, do you think?
Gail, do you want to start with that?
Oh, I thought you were going, Rod. I thought you were going with Kamala.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
no.
Yeah.
I need some time to sit with that one.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think one of the things I noticed in rereading the essay was the ways in which Stuart talks about diaspora, and he's talking as well in a lot of ways in relation to Jamaica again, and the ways in which Jamaica and Jamaicans came back to a sense of Africa and its presence. You know, he talks about the three presences in the essay: African, European, and now. And what I notice is that actually Africa as the continent and its people, it's, say, Africans in Britain who are part of the diaspora, or Africans in the US who are part of the diaspora, kind of goes missing.
Mm-hmm.
It's Africa as an idea and as a cultural icon in a sense, but Africans as part of, you know, diasporic Africans as part of the conversation goes missing. And I think now, and I may be wrong, I may be completely wrong, that I think the question of how are all of these theoretical, political, epistemological, ontological questions thought about, there is an insistence that we need to think about what's coming from the continent itself to help us understand. So Zaitu Matabele's stuff around queer, for example, a South African activist scholar, queer person. The ways in which we really, to think about queer and its Anglo-Europeanness, which includes the US, of course, the Anglo-American notions, that we have to really think with what's the how does it translate into the continent, and how does it translate into different parts of the continent, that I think then get picked up in part of the diasporic conversations in the UK and in the US, as insofar as I am the little bit of the few streets that I tread in New Haven of the US where I hear some of those conversations going on. So this isn't some national, you know, that there's that, and that seems a major transformation. That when we say about our Africanness, hang on, what about the continent? What about actually people formed in the continent, not just in relation to an imagined continent?
Gail's talking about her friends at this moment.
What'd you say?
I was like, you're talking about your friends at this moment, right? In New Haven.
Oh, maybe. Okay. No, but students in the classroom.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
In the classroom. Yeah, no, that's really where it comes from. Students in the classroom who are insisting. Those students whose parents, you know, migrated.
Yeah. I mean, if I could jump in, I think that, you know, it's uneven, right? I mean, I think that the students are insisting upon it because oftentimes they're not necessarily seeing it, you know, in the curriculum, you know, and in the writing. I mean, you know, like in terms of African American studies, I think that the way in which the category diaspora has been deployed has not necessarily been a kind of will to grapple with, you know, the enormous complexities, you know, past and contemporary on the continent, you know? And I do think the field of art has made greater advances than, say, you know, the scholarship in African studies, African American studies, you know, in this country. I mean, that's the thing that I would like to see, you know, as you know. You know, I think there's work that we have to do to make the category diaspora attend to or answer the students, you know, in the way that they deserve to be answered. And that is, okay, reflect for us, the complexities of where we come from, who we are, and have that held in the terrain of Black studies. I think that is still work we need to do.
Mhm. But I think that's right, Rod. And but I think I'd also add, obviously, so this essay was produced, in 1990. In 1996, Avtar Bra's Cartographies of Diaspora book of essays came, and where she really advanced us in terms of thinking about the concept of diaspora and how we might understand it as a way to analyze and to mobilize within the social.
Yeah.
With her concept of diaspora space. Now, of course, Avtar Bra, very much influenced by Stuart's work, very much kind of carrying on the lines that he laid down. But diaspora space, where she importantly tells us that diaspora space is not about a returning home and all of that kind of thing. But it's also a place where those who've moved have moved, and those who have stayed put have been moved.
Right.
So that then the understanding of locations within something called the national are spaces of diasporic engagement, tension, and movement within the hopes towards progressive transformation, but equally could be reactionary transformation.
Oh, yeah.
But that sense of diaspora, as actually we're all imbricated in it.
Yeah.
And that's a crucial contribution from Avtar. Absolutely. Building out of Stuart, but showing us how, if we work with Stuart, we can, and allow ourselves to do the work, challenge ourselves to do the work, we can produce new stuff. So I'd say that. And then, of course, Avtar's coming out of the Black feminisms, or what we now call Black and brown feminisms of OAD, in thinking about how do we come together and understand your movement and my movement and how we got here and what we do, but now we're here.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, my comment was more about the institutional interpretation of the rich work that's out there on diaspora that hasn't fulfilled the richness of that work in practice.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I wasn't arguing against you, Rod. I was just
No, but I think I remember when, this isn't necessarily the sort of Black context, but in the South Asian context in this country, when Gayatri Gopinath, published Impossible Desires, right?
Yeah.
And, her analysis of diaspora as a category that held predominantly by nationalism. And then the way in which, sort of South Asian feminist and also queer groups within the US and also within the cultural work, we're trying to sort of grab it out of the hands, of nationalists, so that its queer and feminist possibilities and also contours, could be better seen, right? We have yet to materialize analyses like that.
There's a question about that, if I can jump in, from Sakshi Wadwa. It says, they say, in the tensions between being and becoming, how do you see popular sovereignty and self-determination play out further with the difference between a unified people and amorphous, distinct masses? How do we reconcile identity? But some other questions as well. We've had another question just going back to Bra and other thinkers of that time. So Paul Gilroy as well. Do you feel that there's a lack of synthesizing an anonymous writer writes, synthesizing thought that Hall offered in the 80s and 90s and that we lack today? To me, so much is happening in relation to these issues. BLM, the attack on critical race theory, the Me Too movement, the growth of genuine near-overt racist Nazi political formations. Yet I do not feel that we have overarching perspectives that Hall and Gilroy provided from the mid-80s onwards. So 2 questions there that sort of connect to what you were just speaking to. Would you like to, either of you, to jump in?
Want to jump in, Rod?
Well, I would just say that, I actually think that, what Gail brought up and, sort of what I was trying to point out in cultural studies and its theoretical legacies, and also in this essay, in terms of, it's not unity versus the amorphous. It's, sort of unity versus, an awareness of the internal complexities and differences within cultural formations and the stoppage, like where are the stakes, so that you could, sort of acknowledge a heterogeneity, within, say, Blackness, and also come to an understanding of what needs to be addressed, right? So an example of that, would be, precisely, I think, the way in which many people are responding to this moment, in terms of like the book bans, the targeting, the repression around critiques of, the genocide, that you've got all of these different, groups who are, trying to make their voices heard on behalf of, say, take the issue of like the issues of the book bans, Florida, the state of Florida, has banned pretty much everything having to do with like queerness, feminism, race, people of color. In the context of the Palestine solidarity work, you see Black people, you see Asians, you see whites, you see Native folks, you see Latinx folks, all of whom announcing and holding their differences and also agreeing that they can mobilize their differences, their histories with colonialism, their histories with segregation, for this particular issue, So I think that we need to learn from that and do more of that, where people aren't, sort of suppressing their differences in the name of a unified response, but actually mobilizing their differences, and harnessing them for an intervention around particular, struggles. I hope that makes sense.
It does to me. Gail, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question about people doing the kind of gathering up thinking that, and to be honest, I don't know whether it's happening or not. I would, in a way, I feel hesitant to say it isn't, because I feel I don't know. But what I do think, and this is maybe wrong, that what we see in terms of activism and what we see in terms of some of the cultural practitioners, the artists, the filmmakers, etc., who are trying to attend to this moment by speaking to both what it's possible to be, and offer us some of the tools to become something else, but doing so in a way that doesn't try to speak for others, but opens the space for saying, if I can be this, can you be in conversation with me? And somehow we kind of overlap in that conversation, those artistic productions, if you like, and carry forward, or lay down and carry forward, a terrain in which it is possible to be otherwise, if you like, to be otherwise. And I think that's happening. I think as well that the activism that we've seen around Palestine, and just who is on those pickets, marches, demonstrations, the calls, that coming together in a kind of recognition of the urgency of both a solidarity, but a refusal to be spoken for by governments complicit with and making possible genocide. So, which is to say, maybe on the ground, in the sort of, in activism, and I don't want to reify activism, but maybe the activism is ahead in terms of the coming together, than what's going into the written texts as opposed to the other texts of cultural representation that may be going on. And I don't know, it's a hunch. Maybe it's a hope as well. But it's just what one has seen, what I've seen in terms of in New Haven and in London, in terms of the activism around Palestine, for example, and what one sees in the cultural productions.
Absolutely. Two comments here or questions which I'll just read aloud, and I feel you've answered them already, but just to say, one was about Palestine and the many Muslim diasporic bodies who have moved to the global north and can relate to, where do they sit in your analysis of diaspora, of Hall's understanding of it. And then Rod Earl, that was an anonymous comment, and then Rod Earl's comment, which was that in the last 18 months or so, issues around anti-Semitism have divided parts of the anti-racist and left movements, particularly since the Israeli army's devastation of Gaza. Jewish identities are almost the definitive diasporian set of identities, but appear to have become anchored by Zionism. We talked about this in our very first event in this series, national essentialism and whiteness in a présence European. Hall ends this essay, as Rod rightly says, with nods towards Benedict Anderson's 1982 imagined communities. But how are we to move out of the shadow of the national imaginary, the most powerful and enduring, perhaps, of strategic essentialisms? It's another mammoth question. But I think, again, something that's propped up in all the three sessions we've had in this Reading the Crisis, really. How can we move beyond the nation? We felt that sort of talking especially about Zionism and the development of it in the very first conversation, that we had felt that previously as a historian, I'm probably saying that, we thought we had moved beyond the nation state, and yet here we are again, trapped within it, and how cultural identification can be used to resist, but also can be co-opted, instrumentalized. Either of you want to take that question? Or do you want to think about it and I'll come back to it, and I can ask another question about other parts of the world?
Well,
maybe I'll just, take a first shot. I think that, in many ways it is what the essay is getting at, especially toward the end, the quote from Fanon is exactly this, right? How is it that the nation, to riff off of Gail, like resides in us psychically, yes, there is the way in which the nation is a social structure, but its entrenchment is also about a kind of psychic sort of embeddedness. So how do you, wrestle with that, try to eject it, blah, blah, blah. Part of what I appreciated in rereading this and was reminded of is that, he makes the argument that this cannot be a notion of diaspora that takes the nation as the natural ground.
Exactly.
Right? So it cannot be about then reproducing the violence of the nation. If you think back here to, Max Weber's argument that the nation state is that formation that claims to have a monopoly on the legitimacy of violence, right? And what does it mean then to presume a notion of diaspora that takes the nation as axiomatic and then, reproduces the logic of violence from the nation? So we need a different notion of diaspora or a different articulation of diaspora, and they are out there. And part of what's at stake in that is that so that we're not reproducing the violence of the nation state form or of nationalist ideology. That seems to me to be his argument about what's at stake in terms of the rearticulation of diaspora, of cultural identity, and of the cultural past.
And central to that, just to riff off that, is that he talks about diaspora as, actually I wrote the quote down, diaspora identities are those which are continually producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. And that question of difference here, not just being, the Derrida differ and
Right.
differ meaning, but difference as what Audre Lorde called non-dominant difference. So we recognize again our specificity, but we don't put it in a hierarchy, but rather in a field of difference that needs then a way to be articulated, to use another Stuart Hall kind of concept, you know. And it seems to me in that context then, the different, viewed through that prism, somebody talked about the very different varieties of Muslim groups that have you know, moved to the global north. They're part of that field of non-dominant difference. That we need to make it non-dominant difference. We need to grapple with our psychic investments in hierarchical difference, as well as the social order of hierarchical difference, in order to make your specificity and mine be able to be in commune with each other and in conversation with each other. So I think that's part of the project that's laid out for us. But it's also, my mind's also turning now is to where do we look for considerations of all these questions? Because so far we've kind of looked at, you know, social structures, psychic structures, big stuff up there to governments and modes of governance and implicitly racial capital and its globalized logics and all of that implicitly. But if we look at the bottoms, at the ends, at the blocks, as we might say, if we're in London, you know, the people who live in the blocks, you know, the projects, I guess, would be called here in the US. The people at the end, in the bottoms, where actually the living of life is both in keeping with the normative and also in radical refusal of it. Everywhere you go, you hear it on the bus, you see it in the market, you pick it up in little bits and pieces. That maybe our own families, you know, but it's there that I think that we begin to see some of the living practices of reproducing themselves in transformation and difference, because it's precisely in refusal of the normative, even whilst when we go to our work or we're stopped by the police or we go to the health services, we're positioned again in the normative, but our lives are lived somewhere else. And that's, I think we need to look there too. And that's what is picked up, I think, by artists and cultural producers. That's the stuff that they reflect back to us oftentimes. And there might be something that we can harness to develop our thinking and also to make our thinking more in alignment with what's being lived in the bottoms.
Yeah, you know, if I could also add that, you know, when you were talking, Gail, I was thinking about, you know, in the essay, he invokes the category of deferral in terms of Derrida in the beginning of the essay. But by the end, the deferral is not about Derrida. It's about the deferral of the nation state and nationalist ideology, you know? And, you know, to your point, I think that we see that deferral all over the place. I mean, you know, when I was going to, you know, and participating in the encampments here or visiting, you know, encampments in the UK, invariably, you know, it was always a sign, you know, Jews for ceasefire, or, you know, Jews against the war, or...
Not in my name.
Exactly right. You know, the encampment here were Muslim and Jewish students in common prayer. You know?
Exactly.
So the deferral is happening, you know,
exactly,
in terms of the deferral of the nation state, but also a nationalist articulation of certain cultural identities. That is happening. You know? We have to encourage it, but we have to build upon it. You know, to use his category, that also has to be serialized.
Exactly.
That's an important point. You're both talking so concretely and profoundly there about where we have to look. But just to bring back to some of the points that have been made that are more on a sort of a broader canvas, but I think you've sort of answered these. Two people have asked about where do you think Black and Brown, especially South Asian solidarity, lies today. In the UK, we've had a history that's been obscured of collective solidarity and organising together, but young people today in the UK at least are drawing clear lines between Black and Brown struggles. I feel you've sort of answered that. I mean, the encampments was, Palestine protests, maybe one space in which this is happening. AD, that was an anonymous question. AD says, I appreciate that question because as a US citizen who spent time living in the UK, I was surprised, I think, by the politicisation of Black and shared history of the African diaspora and South Asians, because I do not see or experience this in the same manner in the US. And I appreciate the speaker's ideals on solidarity in both the US and the UK. And then Joanna de Groot says, do we need to think more about the slippages and or tensions between the material, physical aspects of space underpinning notions of, let's say, Africa or Asia, and the imaginative, psychic aspects and their political manifestations and enactments? I think you've touched on some of those issues in those answers, but if you'd like to jump in on any of those, otherwise there's many other questions I can go to. Lots and lots of people also saying, thank you so much. This is a really brilliant and interesting conversation. A question about Bra, which I'll come back to, Avtar Bra. In her book, Avtar Bra asks, when does a place of residence become home? Just wondering how this shapes our thinking about diaspora and how it's deployed in academia in everyday life. Are we at home in academia, Gail?
No.
Yes. Oh, no.
No. Do we navigate a way through to some extent, I guess, more importantly, perhaps it's how do we take the resources that it offers and the challenges and responsibilities it gives us to say, how do we begin to invite students to think in this way and to enable themselves to say, really to imagine themselves differently. That's the challenge and the responsibility, I think. Whether that's about finding a home in the academy, I think not. It may be saying something about learning is a separate thing. It may happen in a space called the academy, but it's not what the academy thinks of as learning. But learning and being able to continuously learn as part of the process of always in process of becoming might be the thing that we can get some of the resources to help inculcate in students, just as students press us to do that in the challenges they pose, I think. Because the institution is one thing, the relations of teaching and learning can be another, I think. I don't know, that just came to me.
Excellent. Rod, do you want to say something?
Well, I mean, I'm still thinking about the Kamala Harris question.
Oh, yeah.
I could actually ask that question if you want a little bit more detail, because there were two separate questions.
Okay, maybe ask.
So the first was, they're both by anonymous attendees. How does Kamala Harris's accession to the Democratic presidential candidature, what does it mean, I think, for this discussion now? And second, do you think the concept of the Black Atlantic has broken down, given that the outsider group, outsider in quotation marks, in some parts seem to identify with their nation states? So back to the nation issue again, the conception of UK Black history and the position of African Americans regarding Kamala Harris. I think just to sort of spell out also that there's questions about her sort of identification, isn't there, as a Black American? I think perhaps maybe that's also alluding to that. Again, a different kind of issue to how it is might be perceived in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm reminded of something that Angela Davis recently said in an interview where she was talking about just the sort of dismal state of politics and political culture, in the U.S., particularly in this election season, right? And she said that it is a moment to remind ourselves of something that people always knew, going back to especially in the civil rights movement, the moment in which people think, the point of that was the achievement of the vote and electoral office. And that was never the point, It was always about grassroots struggles. Like voting was just, sort of one item on the menu. It was not supposed to be the most important item, within which we would lend, our psychic energies, our hopes, to the detriment of all the other items, especially community organizing and grassroots organizing. It's never supposed to be that, right? The danger of this moment and what, it looks like Kamala Harris will get the full endorsement from the Democratic Party. The danger of this moment is that it can simply be a confirmation that the point of politics is in their sort of electoral, sort of embodiment, right? And that becomes a way to identify with the nation state, through now a Black woman. You saw something similar with when Barack Obama, was the president here, that, much of the political imagination was around who is Barack Obama? What's he going to do? What kind of way in which he might save us? That's the danger of this moment, in that it becomes a kind of resource for the kinds of identifications that Hall talks about, that Gail, has also pulled out. We can be pragmatic, in terms of voting. We don't have to necessarily also then use that pragmatism as the stage for our identifications,
Yeah.
But another side to that question is really that I think it was in the text of a previous question, but there's now a specific question about this, which is about strategic essentialism. So Bill Usman says, from my own complicated identities, I understand my voice as a Jew for Palestine as an embodiment of strategic essentialism. I wonder if the presenters might reflect on strategic essentialism in this current moment. A reminder that strategic essentialism being where a group that clusters around a kind of cultural identity, a social identity, decides perhaps to kind of essentialize in some way in order to gain some sort of political traction. I'm hugely simplifying there, so do take that apart if you want. Gail, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, well, I would say that sometimes we absolutely have to use it. As someone who came back, at one point was a kind of sociologist of social policy, if you like. So I'm often thinking about, from where do we make claims on the state, as I talked about earlier. So, for example, all of the evidence that's coming up in the British context, and we know it's the same in the US context, but the ways in which Black and brown, to use the current language, women in the US in the UK who are giving birth are denied all sorts of assistance or a capacity for agency in thinking about how they birth and whether they get painkillers and all of that, because the idea is that Black women feel no pain at all and Asian women feel a tiny bit, kind of, I'm being a bit crude here, but this idea that those women don't need assistance in birthing. Then obviously the claim that we make for proper healthcare in pregnancy and maternity services can be done on the basis of a strategic essentialism. I think that's absolutely makes sense, and it's done in a language that speaks to the ways in which the stats are gathered in those institutions, if they're gathered at all, and it also identifies a specific profound abuse that's happening in the service delivery. So I think that would happen. And the same, mental health services, it's rife about who gets what, access to what and how and all of that. So I think that would always be important. But it does seem to me that's a bit like, to go back to Rod's word, pragmatic. It's about it's mobilizing for a particular demand or set of demands for access to a particular set of resources. It's not us saying, it's not the end point, this is who I am, kind of thing. So in that sense, I think we would always need to do that.
Yes. It's that tension again between a process of becoming and acknowledgements of difference, and then the mobilizing for, yes, although I suppose they're implying that it's something where people will join in, but they're not always favored the fact that they're, taking part in something that is a form of strategic essentialism, I guess, and then limitations and frustrations and compromises that are seen as going too far come to. Perhaps.
But in that process as well, that might also provide an opportunity so, groups of women get together to make those demands. And in the process of kind of politicizing it, becoming a community in action, if you like, a temporary community in action, there may well also gain a sense of, oh, there's something transforming here. This is also in process of becoming. Me and my sisters, as it were, it's a political opportunity for thinking and understanding differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what I hear in the colleague's question, is that part of Hall's essay where he's talking about, rearticulation of the past, and that as a way of acknowledging the workings of power in cultural identity and also in the narratives of culture, right? So that in this instance, if you rearticulate your identity, as a Jewish person against the essentialist notions deployed by a nation state, in this case, Israel, it then obligates one to think about the historical components of that identity that veer away from the nation state's, apprehension of it, like the way in which the nation state tries to make, that very complex, very rich history into a univocal one in service of the nation state, So if it compels, the best strategic essentialisms ought to compel us to do that kind of, sort of searching of the past and rearticulating the past. And people are doing it now. I mean, that's another interesting thing about this moment. So you see, sort of Jewish writers and scholars, saying, okay, hold on, let's talk about the moments in which Jewish identity, culture, Judaism, were made to be in the service of, state nationalism, and how that is, a contrivance.
Absolutely. A couple of comments about what you've just been talking about. Thank you for this conversation. The impression I get is that we must explore, says an anonymous attendee, these questions of identity across different scales, not just in relation to the nation, but also how it manifests and emerges in our everyday encounters. A brilliant conversation, another anonymous attendee says, goes a long way in instilling a certain reassurance in this bleak time, especially against the backdrop of what's happening in Palestine. The Indian state attempts to invisibilize as well as criminalize solidarity with the Palestinians, and there's a cause of grave concern. Another anonymous says, what Gail is mentioning about birthing prejudices on Black women is in Sylvia Federici's book, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, is a perfect source on this. Two big questions, but I'm just going to run back to an earlier question, which I thought was very interesting. We're slightly running out of time and there's more and more questions coming, so I'll try to get to as many as we can. There was one which was about modes of writing. Thank you, Gail and Rod, for this incredible conversation. I would love to get your thoughts on rewriting. I find that to be such a rich concept, and it's a very clear refusal of knowable, fixed, coherent archive and story. Can you both share how you might take Hall's notion of rewriting to discuss methodology and or acquiring of methodology?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the things that I learned when I first started reading Stuart Hall in 1994, which is also when I met him and Catherine Hall, because one of my advisors, George Lipsitz, had invited them to UC San Diego, where I was a graduate student. And it was my first year of graduate school. I actually didn't know who he was. And then afterwards, I realized, okay, I really need to know who this man is. And so ever since then, I think that I have only ever rewritten, you know? But I've always thought that that sort of project of rewriting, whether it's, all right, in my first book, let me rewrite the history of sociology, and then the history of, African Americans in this country in relation to sociology around sexuality, gender, race, or in the second book, let me try to rewrite the narrative of the American university, you know. In the third book, let me try to rewrite the narrative of US student movements. And in the fourth book, let me try to rewrite the story of the Stonewall Rebellion and what came after that. There are multiple genealogies here, Stuart Hall, but it's always Stuart Hall in relation to, a kind of feminist and queer mandate to rewrite as well. And so that rewriting agenda, is in many ways a feminist and queer articulation of Stuart Hall's mandate, around rearticulation, So I'll just say that and maybe bounce it off to Gail.
Well, I guess in similar mode, really. I'm not going to give you a series of books because they're not there, but I suppose there's a way in which some of the pieces that I've written have been attempts to rewrite the stories of Britain in a particular moment. So my birthing racial difference, conversations with my mother and others, which is absolutely a rewriting through what I would call an experience near embedded theoretical place, the story of what it meant, of how we could understand interracial relationships and the birthing of children like me, kind of thing, in my case, a white mum and a black father, at a moment. So it came out in 2009, at a moment when there was a kind of lot of applauding of, look, at the biggest growing category is the mixed category. And look what that says about race relations in Britain. And all of this nonsense, as some salute. So that's a kind of autoethnographic telling of the domestic and psychic life of racism in its gendered articulations and classed articulations in one household that I grew up in a sense. And it's done as a letter but it is an attempt to retell. It's an attempt to make an intervention into that particular moment. Similarly with, I've done something similar in relation to my fathers as well, to talk about the psychic recovery of Black men as fathers in my life, but to go against the narrative that Black men cannot be fathers and cannot be psychically experienced as fathers. That's the key thing of that text. So rewriting in that sense. So it's about ways of retelling the stories and maybe also thinking about the form in which those rewritings happen. And I've gone more and more to the epistolary form. Let me write a letter that can feel experienced near and can also both make statements that are claims, if you like, theoretical claims, but saying these are not the be all and end all because it's one woman in conversation and influences from multiple places who's making an offering. So the rewriting in that sense to kind of destabilize the idea of the one who knows.
Yeah, and I'll also say that, part of, there's a link here between, the question of rearticulation at the level of writing and also what's at stake in becoming, like the rearticulation in writing says to the reader, you can become, that part of you that is questioning, that part of you that feels a nudge of something different, you can do it. You can let that part of you run free, So, a story that I like to tell is when I taught Gail's birthing racial difference piece, to my incarcerated students. This is about 4 years ago. And we ended with that piece. This is at a maximum security men's prison, mostly Black men in the room. We ended with that piece, and the first thing they said was that that piece was amazing. And I said, amazing. And they said, amazing. And I realized that for them, one, it gave them, those who are biracial, it gave them a language, to talk about their complicated relationships, of love and frustration and anger with their mothers. It also gave all of them a language for talking about how, race, nationalism lives at very effective levels, And so some of them went on to write, pieces, essays about their relationships, intimate relationships with mothers, but also with family because of that, So there is a way in which, the rearticulated, writing as rearticulation gives permission to readers, to become what they want to become, what they didn't know they could become,
And that reminds me, running away, of the part in Stuart's Familiar Stranger, where he talks about being at Paddington. He's going to Oxford, his mum's with him on the station, and he sees all these West Indians, as we were called then, at Paddington. Paddington, it's Paddington, in 1951. So, and he thinks, oh, there's all those people that are kind of like me, but not like me. Maybe I can become like them.
Yeah.
And that would be people like my dad,
Yeah.
So just that moment where he articulates that you see something or you experience something, say, oh, some recognition, a kind of uncanny recognition, if you like, that can then become different.
Yeah. No, sort of like, well, it's the sort of nationalist rendering of culture, in its production of essentialism, is about constraining the possibility. Like,
Totally.
Rearticulation is about producing the conditions for possibilities to open up.
Yeah.
And I think that practice of rewriting that you're talking about and rearticulation speaks to this question I just wanted to read out from Fernando Herrera, which says, to avoid eulogizing a great thinker, what do you find unsatisfactory or wanting in Stuart Hall back then and now? Or in another way, what is our challenge now, as well as what was his? Thank you. But I wonder if really it's both those things. One is our challenge is to rewrite it, or to write the bits of it that we feel need rewriting for now and using them, but also I suppose in the reading it and becoming transformed by it, becoming through the reading of Hall and trying to find new ways, new conditions of possibilities of say. I don't know if you want to add to that at all, or you might disagree with what I've just said.
No, I don't disagree with what you just said, but for me, the thing that's always was and continues to be wanting in Stuart is a sense that in his mind, as he's writing and in conversation with people, because just have to know Stuart at the Open University, he wasn't a singular, he wasn't like, I'm just doing this. It's like in conversation and for a collective project, the purpose of a collective project. But the figure of the Black woman as a site and resource for mobilizing radical transformation, perhaps for having ideas about, and Black feminism as a site of that, I think was missing, very much missing. And that's all of a piece with the ways in which the figure of the Black woman in the UK is sort of unimaginable at one level. She's not unimaginable as a school kid who might be bringing drugs into school and therefore needs to be strip searched at 15 years old on her period, child Q I'm referring to in Hackney, and abused by the police and by the school. She's not unimaginable as a source of contamination, but as somebody who might offer something, whether we agree with it or not, in a sense, the figure of the Black woman disappears. And we saw it so profoundly around the Diane Abbott thing, 46 times standing up in Parliament with a red jacket on, never called, and disappearing from that national conversation that was sparked when that guy, what was his name? The guy, the Tory donor.
Frank Hester.
Sorry?
Frank Hester?
That's right, yeah, who did that abuse about, you know, you see Diane Abbott and you want to kill all Black women, she should be shot. Being allowed to be said, and of course it wasn't racist or sexist, the colour doesn't matter to me, and racism's terrible, but in the responses to that, Black women as a living, embodied, sentient category, and as a category of representation disappeared. It all became about diversity, minorities, all that kind of stuff. So there's a way in which there's something that's pervasive about the absence of Black women in British thinking. And for me, a little bit Stuart's in that thing. But we can do something with Stuart's work ourselves to bring ourselves back in. So that's the difference.
Thank you. Rod, would you like to have the last word?
You know, there's a part, I mean, sort of, you know, again, in conversation with Gail, like there's a part in cultural studies and its theoretical legacies where he says, you know, he would never forget the moment in which the feminists, and he's talking about the white feminists, as Gail has said, right, in this instance, were trying to get the dudes, you know, to understand the significance of gender as a social formation, right, and as a psychic formation. And I've always thought, what would it mean if, because he notes it as a shift, but he doesn't necessarily run with it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't really assimilate the shift. And what would have happened if he had assimilated that shift? And I don't say that, you know, out of judgment or any harshness, but as a kind of object lesson, right? You know, for myself. And also as a teacher and as a writer, like, how do I teach myself? How do I teach my students to recognize a shift, even in the most suggestive mode, you know, to just sit with it and then build from it, you know? And yeah, that would be it.
Okay, thank you so much. That's an amazing place to end, I think. Lots and lots of rich thoughts there. And sadly, we do have to draw today's conversation to a close. So thank you so much to Gail Lewis and to Roderick Ferguson for all their insights and what I think we can all agree was a fascinatingly rich discussion. And I'm sorry if we couldn't get to everybody's questions. We will try to post them perhaps on when we put this on the website in terms of the video. Thanks also again to Tayeb Amin and to Asad Malik for their support in running this event. Thank you especially to the Esmée Fairbairn Foundation, the Barry Amiel and Norman Melburn Trust, and to Duke University Press for making this event possible. A recording, as I said, will be made available in the next few weeks. Please do keep an eye on the Explore section of our website, which has a growing set of digital learning resources. That's stuarthallfoundation.org. And a friendly reminder, we are a small charity and our programs would not be possible without support from our funders and friends. So if you enjoy our work, please help us by making a one-time donation or by pledging a monthly gift. Please use the link that's in the chat box. So many thanks again to Gail and to Roderick. It was honestly a huge privilege to be in conversation with you. And finally, a massive thank you to all of you for joining us today and across the entire Reading the Crisis series. We hope these conversations will continue in other forms and in other locations in the weeks and months that follow, not least in our autumn keynote with Robin D.G. Kelly taking place at Conway Hall in London on the 5th of September. Tickets for that are now on sale via our website, stuarthallfoundation.org. So I hope to see you there. But for now, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.